the Catholic vote. In part 2 of our exclusive polling, a breakdown of where the faithful stand on social issues. Visit to Bethlehem. What President Joe Biden said about Palestinians and Israel before heading to Saudi Arabia. Safety for the Supreme Court. How one Maryland county is stepping up amid a push to protect the justices. And beloved Franciscan, celebrating the saint and mystic who raises our minds to God. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, July 15th, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on this feast of Saint Bonaventure. I'm Tracy Sable. President Joe Biden is in Saudi Arabia tonight, continuing his Middle East tour. As you may recall, as a presidential candidate, he vowed to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah because of its human rights records. Additionally, President Biden has harshly criticized Saudi Arabia for its crackdown on dissidents. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, good evening to you. Today, President Joe Biden met for the very first time with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But the questions shouted at both world leaders were about the killing of a journalist back in 2018.
Exchanging a fist bump, President Joe Biden meets with the Saudi Crown Prince. The ebb and flow of the world's oil supply could depend on their relationship. The United States, however, does not expect any announcements on a boost to Saudi Arabian oil production. But as leaders sat down and got ready to talk, the questions shouted from reporters involved the killing of a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. U.S. intelligence believes the Crown Prince likely approved Khashoggi's killing, which he denies.
Jamal Khashoggi, will you apologize to his family, sir?
President Biden, is Saudi Arabia still a pariah?
Earlier in the day in the West Bank, President Biden, during a joint appearance in Bethlehem with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, restated his continued support for two states for two peoples.
Both of whom have deep and ancient roots in this land, living side by side in peace and security.
President Biden also pledged some $300 million in aid to the Palestinians, including to hospitals that serve Palestinians in East Jerusalem.
Above all, there must be an end to the violence that has devastated too many families.
Meanwhile, dozens of Palestinians protested against President Biden's visit to the city. They carried banners denouncing Israeli settlement activities and called for justice for a Palestinian-American journalist killed during an Israeli military raid this past spring. President Biden also visited the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. The White House said President Biden's visit was to underscore support for Christians who face challenges across the region.
President Biden will continue his overseas trip tomorrow. He'll meet with leaders from Iraq, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. And today he said, we are not going to leave a vacuum in the Middle East for Russia or China to fill. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Well, as you may have heard, an activist group in the nation's capital is offering to pay people for sightings of conservative U.S. Supreme Court justices. Now, Republicans are calling on the Attorney General to bring charges against that group. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, good evening, Tracy. Yeah, the left-wing activist group ended up tweeting out that they would pay up to $50 for a confirmed sighting of a Supreme Court justice and up to $200, listen to this, $200 if the justice actually remains at the location when protesters show up. Now, this all comes after protesters ended up showing up at a D.C. area restaurant where Justice Brett Kavanaugh was having dinner with his family. He ended up having to leave through the kitchen door. Republicans say that these types of actions are putting the lives of justices in danger.
Those people should be arrested. Put them in the D.C. jail with the pre-trial January 6th defendants who I saw in their jail cells rotting away. Why aren't those people in the jail with them?
These organizations that are paying for location, they should be investigated. There should be a cease and desist order.
Republicans tell me what is most concerning. Attorney General Merrick Garland has yet to bring any charges against anyone who's protested the Supreme Court justices, despite laws in place which prohibit such demonstrations.
The Attorney General needs to follow the law and protect the justices of the United States. We saw an attempted murder at the home of Justice Kavanaugh, and still this Department of Justice won't follow its responsibility to protect the judiciary and to enforce the law.
Senators Bill Hagerty and Mark Warner have written congressional leadership asking for an additional $20 million on top of the current funding for Justice's security. The current funding will run out October 1st, but Democratic leadership in both chambers is yet to bring the bill to the floor.
We've got to get this addressed. Senator Warner and I are both extraordinarily concerned about it. This should not be a partisan issue. This is about the third branch of government, and you've got the possibility for a crisis here. We need to acknowledge it and deal with it.
I asked Leader Mitch McConnell about this.
It's absolutely appalling. Appalling that even the president can't bring himself to focus on security for the Supreme Court and for our judiciary.
On a side note, one way that the justices remain calm is through their faith. Now, Justice Clarence Thomas, a Catholic, he ends up having the prayer, a Catholic prayer called the Litany of Humility, hanging in his chambers. Now, he often recites that prayer often. Tracy?
No, that's beautiful. Thank you for that, Eric. Also, I want to switch gears here. I understand there's been some new developments on the two pro-abortion bills going through the House now. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's the Women's Health Protection Act. That is literally abortion on demand. That passed along with the other bill that would intensify and help women be able to switch over to another state to be able to commit an abortion. That passed as well, but Senate Republicans say that they will continue to fight this tooth and nail in the Senate, and they will use the filibuster to make that happen.
And there is calm in Sri Lanka's capital as people cheer their president's resignation. At the presidential palace, protesters celebrated with a traditional food handout. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka's prime minister has been sworn in as interim president. He vows to restore law and order while seeking economic aid from the International Monetary Fund. Well, Iran is revealing a new naval squadron equipped with drones. Footage from Iran's state TV shows launches from vessels in the Indian Ocean. The unmanned systems have a range of about 600 miles and can be equipped with either cameras or weapons. Earlier this week, the White House suspected Iran of supplying drones to Russia. Coming up, more insight into the U.S. Catholic vote, including issues which the faithful care about most. Exclusive polling from EWTN News and Real Clear Opinion Research is shedding light on where the faithful stand both politically and culturally. Yesterday, we examined why President Joe Biden's favorable rating among Catholics has dropped, and now we take a look at Catholic views on the importance of confession and the real presence in the Eucharist. From Real Clear Politics, we are joined by Andrew Walworth, Chief Content Officer, and Susan Crabtree, White House and National Political Correspondent, as well as Dr. Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor and Washington Bureau Chief for EWTN News. Great to be with you all again. Susan, I want to start with you. In the previous discussion, we looked at the political situation with Catholics, especially in light of President Biden's approval ratings. What are some of the social and cultural issues in the poll that you found to be potentially key to the midterms?
I thought it was really interesting that when it comes to this fierce national debate we're having over abortion since the Supreme Court decision on June 24th overturning Roe v. Wade, that even though a slight majority opposed that decision of the Catholic vote, 60% of Catholics still would be less likely to support a political candidate who supports abortion until birth, so unfettered abortion, compared to just 32% who said they would be more likely. And I think that has to do with, the Catholic teachings on the subject. The Catholic vote is much more aware of the nuances of what overturning Roe v. Wade is doing. By a solid majority, 62% said that they are aware that the decision would result in just sending the federal and state legislators would now determine, the state legislators would now determine how to regulate abortion, as opposed to just 24% who believed abortion immediately would become illegal nationwide. And I also thought that this conscious rule that I covered during the Trump era, I thought that was interesting, their responses on that. That means that healthcare workers can opt out of procedures that they're not comfortable with, such as abortion, sex reassignment therapy, physician-assisted suicide. On that issue, Catholics, voters support that conscience rule. Also on gender issues, there was very strong feelings on that. An overwhelming majority of Catholics believe that gender was created by God rather than determined by individuals. And they also thought that 56% thought that allowing transgender people to participate in girls' sports teams conflicts with Catholic teaching. Those are the sort of the top lines on those cultural issues, but they were very, very well educated on those topics.
Yeah, and Matthew, one of the really most striking findings also had to do with violence against Catholic churches and also the pro-life pregnancy centers as well. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we saw in the 2020 polling that Catholics are very concerned about attacks and vandalism on churches, the tearing down of statues. That has continued, but we're actually seeing increases in the level of concern on the part of Catholics across the board. That cuts across every category of Catholic, whether you go to Mass on a daily and weekly basis or almost never. Catholics are very worried about attacks on churches. Obviously, it is in the news. We cover it here on EWTN News Nightly. We cover it across all of EWTN News. But Catholics are also worried about just the level of anti-Christian sentiment that we're finding in the United States today, and protests against Supreme Court justices and their houses and other things. So I think this is a kind of visceral reaction on the part of Catholics to what they're seeing as anti-Christian atmosphere, but also just the general levels of unrest and sort of social deterioration in the country.
Yeah, a big concern for so many of us. Andy, I know you've been paying a lot of attention to the Latino vote. Let's talk a little bit about that. You know, what did the poll have to say about Latino Catholics?
Well, it was interesting because take a question like right track, wrong track for the country as a whole. Catholics as a whole, 59% see the country going on the wrong track, which is a pretty high number. 68% of white Catholics, only 45% of Catholic Latinos see the country going on the wrong track. So Latinos, something out there is working for Catholic Latinos that is, at least in their perception, it's working for them, not so much for other demographic groups. The other thing, though, just sort of more anecdotally, was this challenge to Henry Cuellar down in Texas, who was really challenged in the primary, or rather in the runoff. And held on to his vote. Henry Cuellar is the only pro-life Democrat left in the House right now. So, Tracy, it's interesting to think that in that particular race, where you would think that with a big Latino population, he was able to hang on. So, interesting sort of anecdotal information about how Latinos are viewing things.
Yeah, certainly. Susan, I want to bring you back into this. I know that you've really been a keen observer of American politics for so many years now. Based on this poll and your study of American politics, do you think that Catholics are as polarized as the rest of America right now?
Well, it seems like if you have on the approval rating question and the right track, wrong track, they're less polarized than the rest of the country. It's funny, you have about I would say about 10% difference in the approval rating that Biden is actually doing better among Catholics, but it's still pretty lopsided. And when we talk about the wrong track, that's a huge alarm bells. That should set off huge alarm bells for the Biden administration and incumbents, mainly Democrats, who are controlling both chambers of Congress. So in that capacity, we saw that there's 59% of Catholics said the country is on the wrong track. But 75% of all voters believe the country's off course. So that's like a 16-point spread. So Catholics are actually less divided than the rest of the country.
Yeah, and Matthew, not a whole lot of time left, but I want to leave this last question to you. Talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the other notable findings from this poll.
Well, from a Catholic standpoint, the devotional and sacramental practice of Catholics is of intense interest to us as a network, but it should be of interest to all Catholics. What we found, and exactly as we did in 2020, that 50% of Catholics believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. That number shifts significantly, however, depending upon how often you actually go to Mass, so that 73% of those who go daily or weekly believe in the real real presence. That number drops to about 23% to those who almost never go. That then has an effect also on how often you go to confession. 37% of all Catholics go to confession, but then we're getting into single digits with those who do not attend Mass on a regular basis. That's important as a teaching moment for us, but it also then has this impact on how you're viewing the world, how you're viewing things like Roe v. Wade, and likely how you're going to vote.
Yeah. And Andy, last question here for you. What can we expect in the few coming months? Anything significant, especially for Catholics?
Well, we're going to continue polling. We're going to look more at these cultural issues. Certainly, one of the big questions is to what degree the Roe v. Wade decision is actually going to affect the midterms. And again, it may not be reflected in sort of national numbers, but certainly in certain local races and statewide races, it could be an important factor. So I think that if I had to say one thing I'd be looking at, I'd be following Catholic attitudes about Roe v. Wade going forward. Just add one other thing really quickly, which is that only 61% of the people we polled, the Catholics we polled, knew that Joe Biden was a Catholic.
Wow.
And I think that is really interesting because I don't know what the number is, but I'd love to know what the number was when JFK was president. I would imagine it's closer to 110%.
Well, definitely interesting findings indeed. And thank you all so much for being with us today. We appreciate it. And for more analysis and opinion on the EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research Polling, visit our partners at Catholic News Agency and the National Catholic Register. Up next, the influential saint who is also known as the second founder of the Franciscans. Today marks the feast day of an influential saint in the Franciscan order. Saint Bonaventure was a mystical writer known for his theology and unifying spirit. At a young age, he was cured of a dangerous illness through the intercession of St. Francis and is referred to as the second founder of the Franciscans. And joining us now to discuss is Father Dave Pivonka, president of Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio. Father Dave, welcome back. Always so great to be with you. If you don't mind, can you talk to us more about St. Bonaventure, his life, and also how he became a Franciscan?
Well, thank you so much. It's always good to be with you. It's actually a wonderful story. Bonaventure was studying at the University of Paris. He was quite the intellectual, and he met the friars, and he was inspired by the friars. But one of the things that he said is that they lived a simple gospel life, and that was in somewhat of a contrast with the great intellectuals. I mean, Bonaventure was studying at the University of Paris. Thomas Aquinas was there at that time with some of the greatest minds in the history of the church. But he was attracted by the way these men lived the gospel life. He said they lived it simply, they lived it authentically, they lived it beautifully. And then ultimately, Bonaventure was so attracted that he joined the friars and spent the rest of his life. And as you mentioned, was ultimately the seraphic father of the order, but also our general. So it was just by the witness of the life of the friars that really attracted him.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And you mentioned him being the seraphic doctor. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, well, there's actually been a lot written about that, but the saying is that he burned with the love of Christ, that he was so animated by the love of God and being faithful to the love of Christ that his heart was burning. But one of the things that I think that's most beautiful about Bonaventure is that while he was a great intellectual, he also understood that the heart had to be engaged in the theology. It couldn't simply be an intellectual exercise. So that while he was a doctor of the church, I dare say one of the greatest doctors of the church, he was ultimately animated by a deep, burning love for Christ. And that's really why they gave him that title.
Yeah, and while serving as a superior of the Friars Minor, St. Bonaventure really did created a sense of unity despite the differing ideas of how to interpret St. Francis's message of poverty. That said, how do you think we can best follow his example, especially now, with what we're facing in such a divided world?
That's just such a really, really good point, because it wasn't just what Bonaventure did with the unity in the Franciscans, but it was all religious life. A mendicant religious life. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were radically different in that time. And there was power structures in the church that wanted to suppress them and didn't want to have the Franciscans, the Dominicans. And Bonaventure really engaged them and began to dialogue with them. And it's fair to say that there may not be a Franciscan or a Dominican community if it wasn't for Bonaventure. But one of the things that Bonaventure really stressed was that it can't merely be about laws. He said that you can have all the laws in the church and all the laws in the community, but if the heart isn't engaged, ultimately there's not going to be unity. Everybody can know what the law is, but unless the heart is engaged, unless the heart has been converted, unless the heart loves Jesus, there's not going to be unity. And it seems to me that's exactly what we're seeing in the church is that we have laws in the church, but if the person's heart hasn't been engaged, if their heart hasn't been evangelized, people may not be able to be united in the one law that we have as a church. So I think Bonaventure continually reminded us that it has to be the intellect and it has to be the heart. It has to be the laws and it has to be the heart. And when that comes together, the church can be more united.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I'm curious, how do you think he's still relevant to us today?
Well, particularly here at Franciscan University, one of the things that Bonaventure really focused on was the bringing together faith and reason. You know, I think of Bonaventure, University of Paris, one of the greatest universities at the time, but it wasn't just intellectual. And I'm afraid that in so many universities in our country today, it's merely an intellectual exercise, and you forget faith. So if it's just reason without illuminated by faith, or just faith without illuminated by reason, but Bonaventure reminds us that those two come together, as John Paul continually reminded us as well. Faith and reason have got to come together. They can't be separated. And I think we need to remember that.
Yeah, and Father Dave, anything else that you want to bring up about St. Bonaventure that maybe people don't know about?
I think one of the things that I appreciated about him was ultimately his love for simplicity. This was again, one of the greatest intellects in the life of the church. And yet, when he was taking a look at the mendicant orders, both the Dominicans and the Franciscans, he said they lived a simple gospel life. I think in the world today, we can complicate our faith. We can complicate following Jesus. And Bonaventure, again, one of the greatest intellects ever, says we need to be more simple. That's not to say that it's not wise or not smart or not intellectual, but to live a simple life. And that's something that I think we should always try to remember, is that simply be faithful to Jesus.
Yeah, well said. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to ask you this last question. As you know, yesterday was the feast of St. Katari Tekakwitha, and I know that you visited her shrine. What can you tell us about that experience?
You know, maybe just to connect to what we were just talking about, if you've been to her shrine, it's the simplicity of it. This is a young woman who ultimately we've canonized as a saint. She loved the Lord. She was converted again by the witness of the Jesuits that were visiting. She experienced them, she encountered them, and there was something about them, the way they lived the life, that inspired and moved her. She obviously was converted. But there's this great saint, and it's just a little altar with a little shrine where she's buried. Yeah, it's just a great Franciscan theme about being simple, being small. We find Jesus in the midst of that, and I think she was a great example of that.
Oh, Father Dave, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Always great to be with you.
It's good. Thank you so much.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.